Hello and welcome to Zandu. My name is Francis Wamonje and I'll be sharing this week's messages. My messages this week will revolve around the life of Joseph, who is a very popular character in the Bible. A lot has been taught about his remarkable life, and I'll be sharing snippets and lessons that we can understand from Joseph's life and how he conducted himself. So I'll start from the very beginning. Joseph was the great-grandson of Abraham, a man who begins his life, quite frankly, with a promise. When he gets called in Genesis 12, God says he's going to make him a great nation, and he's one man. But with time, this family grows. It's got very many remarkable characters, and Joseph was one of them. So everybody is familiar with Joseph's grandfather, Isaac, and everybody is familiar with Jacob, who is the father of Joseph. But there was a much larger family with Joseph. And what I want to teach today is about two things: imperfect families and the power of forgiveness. So Joseph was the 11th child of Jacob and Rachel. He'd got other siblings, and I think the story is pretty well known. Originally, Jacob's plan was to marry one wife, maybe, and that was Rachel. But as it happened, on his wedding day, he was suddenly a polygamous man. He discovered that he had been conned, and his first wife was in fact Leah. And while all this drama began to play out, children were born. There were the first 4 who were born to Leah, and then Joseph's mother, feeling the pressure, decided to give her maid to Jacob and got 2 other children, so now there were 6. Leah countered this and got an additional 2, and then afterwards got to an additional 2. So there's 10 children before the coming of Joseph. And Joseph is born into all this drama and a very large family. So it's very interesting when you observe Joseph, because if you think about the dreams and aspirations of his father, Joseph should have been the firstborn, but now he's the 11th born. However, when he is born, his father treats him with favoritism. His father loves him because this was the child of, you can say, of his dreams. This is the child who he had hoped to have first with a woman who he loved and had worked for 7 years to get. But that didn't happen. And as a result, the family is full of strife, and there are conflicts there which are not spoken about in the Bible, but you can clearly see that there is a lot of tension. So the Bible records that Jacob loved Joseph, and Joseph, out of this close relationship with his father, would at times report on his brothers when they did wrong things. And so there's a very close relationship between Jacob and Joseph that we don't hear recorded between Jacob and his other siblings as they grow up. And all this comes to an end, or to a boil, when Joseph is around 17 years old. He's at home with his father, and his father tells him, you know what, go out there and see what your brothers are doing while they're keeping the livestock. Come back to me and tell me how they're faring on. And Joseph sets off. He's an obedient child. He's wearing this multicolored coat that his father had given him, much to the annoyance of his older brothers. And he sets off to go and see what his brothers are up to. We all know how that went down. Initially, they decide to kill him. Then they decide it's not a good idea. And as a compromise, they sell Joseph off for 20 pieces of silver. And that's how he ends up in Egypt. He ends up a slave. He moves from a position of great privilege to a position of being a servant who doesn't get even paid anything. And he bounces from Potiphar's household. Eventually, he does end up in prison for a crime that he had not done. So all these events that happened to Joseph, a teenager during that time, you can imagine the kind of effect they had on his thinking. Why am I here? What did I do to deserve all this? Why did my brothers sell me? Was I worth 20 pieces of silver? And it's very disheartening. And he endures great hardships because there's nothing better than freedom. There's nothing better than being able to walk freely and to do whatever you want to do and express yourself. And you cannot do that if you're a slave or a prisoner. And it all comes to a head eventually, as fate would have it, that Joseph does grow in his gifts, and he does provide a solution which then puts him in a position of great prominence. And so now we begin now to find Joseph as the governor of Egypt, and he's in charge of the whole place. And there's a problem around the world around that time. There's a great famine. And his brothers now come to do business. They have come with money to buy food. They are starving wherever they are. And Joseph had got all the opportunity to exact his revenge on his brothers at that point in time. Instead, we see Joseph looking at them as his family. Initially, he looks like he's a bit annoyed. He asks them harsh questions. But they don't recognize them, but he can recognize them. Joseph does not take advantage of their inability to recognize him because they thought he was dead. And instead, over the series of events, he works very consistently, and eventually he offers his forgiveness to his brothers. And that is how a family gets restored. And that is how a nation gets restored. Because we must always remember that Abraham was in fact the embodiment of a nation. And all his children downstream were the embodiment of the nation that we now call Israel. So this message is essentially to all of us. None of us come from perfect families. There may be favorites in the families. There may be other circumstances that are at play within our families and the places where we are. And beyond even the nuclear family or the extended family, there are work families. There are job families. There are places where we interact as a community. And at any given time, there may be the opportunity to take offense because of real things that have been done against you, real injustices that have been done to you. But like Joseph, we begin to learn a very powerful lesson, that if you forgive, it then tends to heal a lot more things. It doesn't mean that the people who were there were deserving of this forgiveness, but he extended the forgiveness to them. And we can see eventually, this is a family that comes together and is reunited. So this is a powerful lesson which brings to an end my first teaching about Joseph, about the power of forgiveness and the reality that we live in imperfect families around the world. So let us all learn from the lesson of Joseph to forgive as he did, and may our families and our communities be healed. God bless you.